Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Easy Chat English podcast. Today, we'll be talking about something that many of us have experienced at least once in our lives: renting an apartment. I'm your host, Amelia, and I'm here with my colleague and co-host, Ethan.
Hello, everyone. Renting an apartment is such a big part of adult life, isn't it? Whether you're moving out for the first time or relocating to a new city, the process can be exciting but also a bit overwhelming. I know I've had my fair share of ups and downs when it comes to renting.
Absolutely. And today we'll share some of our personal experiences with renting, as well as some useful words and expressions that will help you if you ever find yourself renting an apartment in an English-speaking country. So let's get started. So, Ethan, let's begin by talking about what it's like to rent an apartment. Renting is quite common, especially in big cities where buying a home might be too expensive for most people. For me, renting my first apartment was a big step. I remember feeling excited and nervous at the same time.
Yeah, same here. My first experience renting was right after college. I had just moved to a new city for my first job, and I had no idea where to start. I didn't know the area, I didn't know what kind of apartment I could afford, and I definitely didn't know much about lease agreements. It was a lot to figure out.
Oh, I can totally relate. For those of you listening, the word lease is important to know. A lease is a contract that you sign when you rent an apartment. It outlines how long you'll live there and how much rent you'll pay each month. You also might hear the word tenant, which is what we call the person who is renting the apartment, and landlord, who is the person or company that owns the property.
One of the most stressful parts of renting an apartment is finding the right one. There are so many things to consider, like the location, the size, and of course the price. I spent hours looking at rent listings online when I was searching for my first apartment.
Yes, I've been there. I remember using different websites to look at studio apartments, one-bedroom, and even two-bedroom apartments. I wasn't sure what I needed at first, so I spent a lot of time reading through descriptions and checking the rent prices.
And don't forget about viewing the apartments in person. I found that some apartments look much nicer in photos than in real life. I remember walking into an apartment that looked amazing in the pictures, but when I got there, the kitchen was so small, and the whole place smelled like paint.
Oh no. Yes, viewing the apartment is key, and something else to keep in mind is the location. Is it close to your work or school? Are there shops, restaurants, or public transportation nearby? For me, the neighborhood was super important. Once you've found the perfect apartment, the next step is signing the lease agreement. It's important to read it carefully and make sure you understand everything. A lease will include details about the monthly rent, the security deposit, and things like when the rent is due and whether utilities are included.
Oh yes, the security deposit. That's the amount of money you have to pay up front, usually 1 or 2 months of rent as a guarantee that you'll take care of the apartment. If you damage anything while you're living there, the landlord can use the deposit to pay for repairs.
That's right. And speaking of repairs, it's also a good idea to check the terms and conditions carefully. Some landlords include a lot of rules in the lease, like whether or not you can have pets, or if you're allowed to make changes to the apartment. I remember when I signed my first lease, I didn't realize that the utilities weren't included in the rent, so I ended up paying extra for things like electricity and water.
Yeah, utilities can be a surprise if you're not careful. And here's a tip: if you feel like the rent is too high, sometimes you can negotiate with the landlord. I had a friend who managed to get a discount on her rent because she agreed to sign a longer lease. It doesn't hurt to ask.
Once you've signed the lease and paid the deposit, it's time to move in. Moving day can be both exciting and exhausting. I remember packing all my stuff into boxes and renting a moving truck to get everything to the new apartment. Luckily, I had some friends who helped me out.
That's great. When I moved into my first apartment, I was living on the top floor of a building with no elevator. I had to carry all my boxes up 3 flights of stairs. It was so tiring, but once I got everything inside, it felt amazing to be in my own space.
Definitely. And if your apartment is furnished, that makes things a bit easier. But if it's unfurnished, you'll need to think about furniture, appliances, and setting up things like utilities. I remember having to call the gas and electricity companies to get everything set up.
Oh, that's always fun, isn't it? And don't forget about setting up internet and cable if you need it. There's a lot to think about when moving into a new place, but once everything is set up, it feels great.
Once you've moved in, you also need to think about apartment living rules. Many apartments have specific rules, like quiet hours, which means you have to keep the noise down during certain times, usually at night.
Yes, I had a neighbor who loved playing music late at night, and it was so loud. Eventually, I had to talk to them about it, and we worked out a compromise. It's important to be considerate of your neighbors when you live in an apartment building.
Definitely. And if you have any problems in your apartment, like something breaking, you'll need to submit a maintenance request. I once had a problem with the heating in my apartment, and I had to call the landlord to get it fixed. Luckily, they sent someone over quickly.
That's good. Some landlords are very responsive, but others can be a bit slow when it comes to repairs. It's always a good idea to keep track of any repairs or maintenance issues that come up. Of course, apartment living isn't always perfect. Sometimes you might run into challenges like rent increases or problems with the apartment itself. I remember once my landlord decided to raise the rent when my lease was up for renewal. It was stressful trying to decide whether to stay or look for a new place.
Oh, I've been there. Rent increases are tough, especially if you're not expecting them. It's important to read your lease carefully to see if the landlord is allowed to raise the rent, and if so, by how much. Another issue I've dealt with is noisy neighbors. It can be hard to handle, but usually talking to them politely can help.
Yes, and if things get really bad, you can always file a complaint with the landlord. Another challenge is moving out. You usually have to give a certain amount of notice, often 30 or 60 days, before you move out, or you might lose your security deposit.
Before we wrap up, let's share some advice for first-time renters. If you're new to renting, make sure you read the lease carefully before signing. Pay attention to the fine print and ask questions if you don't understand something.
Good advice. I would also say to budget carefully. Make sure you can afford the rent and any additional costs like utilities. And don't forget to consider things like moving expenses, security deposits, and the cost of setting up your new place.
Yes, budgeting is key. And if you don't have enough credit history, you might need a cosigner to help you get the apartment. A cosigner is someone who agrees to be responsible for the rent if you can't pay it.
That's a good point. And finally, be sure to take care of the apartment while you're living there. If you leave it in good condition, you're more likely to get your security deposit refund when you move out.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's episode. We hope you found our stories and tips about renting an apartment helpful, and that you've learned some new words and expressions that will come in handy if you ever find yourself renting.
Thanks so much for listening, and remember to check out our other episodes for more tips on living, working, and navigating life in English. See you next time.
Bye, everyone.